Welcome back to Finding the Edge podcast. I'm Garrett Boyum, joined with Cal Dupick.
Hey, so we are wanting to look at this book, Dynamics of Skill Acquisition. It seems to almost be like this requisite text. If you are in the ecological dynamics sphere, at some point, maybe you've been suggested it. I'm actually just jumping into it right now, which is different because, my journey has been maybe a year or two of in-depth with ecological dynamics, with maybe some flirting with it for the first 2 or 3 years before that, at least being aware of the ideas. But that wasn't how it was for you, right? Like this was something that you jumped into or was recommended to you right away. Isn't that correct?
Let's begin. Analyzing. Finding the edge.
Yeah, I mean, this book, I think, is kind of the seminal text that is recommended to pretty much everybody to start with. And it was really popular, I think, like around 2016, 2017. And that's kind of when I first heard about it. My former boss, Eugene Bleecker, even before I started working for him, met him at a conference, and he really impressed upon me, like, this book you have to read. Because it was something that I was starting to look into at that point. Driveline was talking a ton about it. And so, yeah, this kind of is a book that everybody, highly recommends. That like, and also being the starting place. I know too. Like, how did you? Why did you just start getting into it?
Well, I think that the Constraints Collective is kind of another. I don't know what to call these different places where Rob Gray's got a Patreon and Emergence has classes, and the Constraints Collective is this new ish within the actually almost like a year exactly, where same thing, Slack channel, places that may potentially interact, some stuff behind a paywall, but also some public front-facing podcasts that they do. So I've been engaging a little bit with their content, and interestingly enough, like Rob Gray was the space that I went into, and then the Emergence guy. So I had sort of stayed domestic with all of the ecological dynamic stuff. I hadn't gotten almost out of the US very much outside of maybe research papers suggested to me by the guys over at Emergence. And so this one was one that I kind of came across. The deeper I got into and the more I started making connections, when I started to see more names come up, this was a book that popped up. And so I bought like 3 or 4 books, texted the list to Sean and Tyler at Emergence, and like they were both without question, nope, number 1 book you have to read of those 4 is Dynamics of Skill Acquisition. So that was intriguing to me because it wasn't like, oh yeah, you could maybe start with this one, this is okay. Like they were both unequivocally like, nope, read that one first, that's the best one of the bunch.
Yeah, and so to me, this is where I think this is why it's good to kind of go through some of this stuff. And one of the things too that I'm thinking about as far as like a series, I want to know too from people who are listening, like, is this something that would be interesting? Because I know like there's a lot of information out there, and at the same time, it feels like it's just coming from a lot of just secondhand knowledge, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, this is getting back to like some of the more concrete stuff. I think sometimes going through the actual literature is helpful for people, but also like myself, sometimes the academic literature can be kind of daunting to approach. And so kind of the idea, the goal here is to kind of walk people through it a little bit, and then also share our story, and then also to add like and kind of pull out our insights. The other thing too that I saw recently, like somebody just did a video on like the challenges of a hitter, and went to Driveline and all this sort of stuff. And Rob Gray was featured in that little documentary that he put together, but it didn't feature very prominently. So there's like some ecological ideas in there,
You bet.
and that's where I feel like, from my experience, and both of us have sat under Sean and Tyler, like, and been mentored heavily by them, and and that experience for me has been way different than me being on the outside trying to figure something out by myself.
For sure.
And so, having both of us been mentored in these things, like it's kind of how do I describe it? Like there's the difference between somebody who, basically studies baseball but didn't play baseball, if that makes sense. And like has been taught like the how a person talks about it is slightly different, how they understand it is slightly different versus somebody who's been in the game, been coached by people. The language and the understanding is different. And so the hope of why we're kind of trying to dive into this a little bit, one is to give people to one, sympathize with people. I think in some ways, I think is what will probably come out when we start diving into this. And then two, to help people, give people a roadmap of like kind of how to navigate through this, or maybe how to hopefully try to help make this text specifically more accessible. So, and if people like this, I think we may do more of this in some form or fashion.
Yeah, even a simple example, and then let's jump into it, is just I remember that initial, it seems like Rob Gray's kind of the gateway drug for everybody into this world. But I remember, hey, keep them coupled. And it was always perception action. And then when I engaged with Sean and Tyler, it's like, wait, perception cognition action? Like, where did that come from?
Right.
And then I read this text and I go, oh, it's right there, and it's been there for a long time. And so I think that's where going back to the source material ourself at times can be very helpful, but also to your point, it can be daunting, and it's been daunting for us at times and thick. And so that's the hope, is to jump into something to try to understand what they're saying and how we're applying it, and where maybe we can best do it within the baseball sphere.
And that's one of the other challenges too. When I first got into this, is like Sean and Tyler, they're always talking, and even with Rob, right? They're always giving other examples with other sports. And even as we go through this, you'll see there's examples from other sports, and you're like, man, how does this apply to baseball? So the hope is today, as we, at some point we'll get to, maybe we'll see. I don't make any promises in this episode, but we'll try to, moving forward, try to show how this relates back to baseball. So that's kind of the goal here. So, when we were kind of going over like this initially, and you kind of brought this to me, like you're going through it with some of your coaches, this book, and we're sitting here, we're trying to figure out like, how are we going to approach this text? And I thought it would be really good to go through it because there's some questions, and going through the questions that you had. But then as we're starting to dive into it, it's like, you know what? You're sitting there being like, I think we want to understand like the authors and what's the author's intent, versus like I wanted to just sit there and expound upon the ideas brought up in the text. And so to start, do you want to kind of go through like what do you see as like kind of the author's intent? And then kind of what I had thrown back to you is that I think we need to start with the table of contents to really get into like, okay, what is the chapter trying to communicate? What's this book trying to communicate to us? And I think we have to kind of start with the table of contents because it gives us the context for chapter 1.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And I think the biggest thing that you pointed out, and it's helpful for you, and it's probably why that whole conversation led to the place that it did, is because it felt like chapter 1 was like, I remember years ago, like learning to do swimming lessons, and unfortunately, the person just threw me in the deep end, and it was a terrible way to learn. And there was this sense in which it felt like chapter 1 is a little bit of like really jumping into the deep end. But what's really interesting is you have the other edition there, where chapter 1's actually traditional theories of skill acquisition, which is a little bit more how a lot of people approach this. Hey, you've probably heard that learning looks like this. And so I think that's an interesting space where maybe we can start to understand like what the differences between the editions are, but also why exactly did they jump in a different spot on chapter 1, and what's the flow of the chapters now that they have with this second edition.
Right. And so chapter 1, the title is Athletes and Sports Teams Considered as Complex Adaptive Systems. And for me personally, like these are like I really like the notion of complex adaptive systems. That for me was foundational, like that understanding. But as we started going through, and I might be jumping ahead here, but as we start, because it lays out initially, okay, so for people who are watching the video version of this, on the left, I have the table of contents for the second edition, and on the right, I have the table of contents for the first edition. Okay, so anybody who's watching along can kind of see where and follow along here. so kind of the first heading is the ecological dynamics theoretical framework, which I think is huge, right? That's what the
Yep.
thing that we talk about all the time. We use this term all the time in tweets, on social media, online. We're like ecological dynamics this, ecological dynamics that. And so
Yep.
that's kind of like the first big heading. The second big heading that they decided to put in the table of contents was learning design and ecological dynamics. And then the third major heading is transfer, conceptualized in ecological dynamics.
Well, don't you think it's interesting? And I'm just making this connection now, and far be it from us to be careful and to assume author intent, but I'm remembering that you identified, I can't remember if it was off camera or we already pressed record, but that the first edition was in like 2007, 2008, and that
2008, yeah.
2008, and that the second edition here is 2021. And we think about like how far this field has progressed, and even more so, as a guy who's been on some calls now and watched some content from people who run within this series of authors, and how different they are and how they've shared their stories, to just simply say, we used to have to defend this a lot more. And it almost seems like they're a little older now, so they're a little bit more exhausted. Like, no, we just think this is a great theory. We just want to talk about it. And so you actually see the difference. And I wonder if that was purposeful, that chapter 1 in the first edition was a little bit more, you can even see, again, if you're watching, common features of traditional theories. So it's pretty clear that they outline some of the more traditional theory and how they're comparing and contrasting. That actually makes sense in 2008. But now in 2021, ecological dynamics has consistently outperformed the traditional. So it might just be like, hey guys, let's just talk about the thing that we really like instead of wasting time doing that. Again, I don't want to assume their intent, but I wonder if that was part of it.
And I think that's a good, maybe a good assumption, or explanation for why that might be. Not to unless you have more, I'm gonna keep moving
No,
here.
let's keep rolling through the
Okay.
contents.
So I'm gonna just go through the second edition's chapters. Like, I'm just gonna go through the headings. I'm not gonna go through the sub headings right now, because otherwise we'll be here forever. So chapter 2 in the second edition, physical constraints on coordination, dynamical systems theory. Chapter 3, informational constraints on coordination and ecological psychology perspective. Chapter 4, intentionality, cognition, and decision making in sport. Chapter 5, understanding the dynamics of skill acquisition. Chapter 6, how interacting constraints support a non-linear pedagogy. Chapter 7, redefining learning, practical issues for representative learning design. Chapter 8, designing individualized practice environments. Chapter 9, practice for team sports. Chapter 10, modified perceptual training for athletes. Chapter 11, practitioners as designers. And then the last chapter, chapter 12, expertise and talent development in sports. And so, having just read through that and looking through that, what do you see in that structure? Do you see anything in themes?
The first thing that jumps out, well, I'd say two. Number one is there's still a lot of similarities from the two editions, but obviously they're starting with the two biggest parts in chapter 2 and 3 being dynamical systems theory and ecological psychology, these two big branches that were kind of brought together. The other thing I would say is if you have been swimming in the waters of ecological dynamics at all, I think one of the things that's interesting when you read the two editions is some of the things that were talked about in the first edition versus the second edition, they seem to be more current events. What you just read there, in terms of like intentionality, cognition, and decision making, that has been, in that gap between 2008 and 2021. Like that's often like, well, what do you guys do with the brain? What do you do with oh, okay, we're gonna write a chapter on it. Whereas some in the previous, as you were reading there, I was kind of comparing to see where they came over. So it does feel like the edition 2 is updated in the sense that you're hearing a little bit more about almost like current events. What is currently being discussed a little bit more in the world of ecological dynamics right now? What questions are they trying to answer? And certainly the field has advanced as well to be more than just, I think some people, kind of saw it sometimes as well. It's just like external cues, right? Or it's just games based theory. It's like, no,
Or
no,
it's
no,
just self-organize.
just self-organized. Yeah, exactly. We've moved, and like this is me saying, like we actually have moved a long way within the research from that. And I think you're seeing that kind of give birth here in their structure. They're actually addressing some of those things that are a little bit more advanced in terms of what we're currently going down the rabbit hole within the ecological sphere.
Right. And so I think from that, I kind of want to jump into the actual chapter itself, because the reason that I read off all of those things, and maybe, in future I should have just mentioned the other chapter names, but I think as we get into this, we'll begin to see, like, when I first read through this chapter, to kind of where I kind of struggled was like knowing what I know about ecological dynamics beforehand. I was kind of sitting there being like, well, why aren't they bringing up this? Why isn't this defined as well as this or whatever? It's because now having looked at the table of contents, I'm like, oh, they're going to dive more into, they're going to dive more into ecological psychology. Like I thought, if we're going to start with like the ecological dynamics theoretical framework as being like the main heading, like how do you not talk about ecological psychology there?
Yeah.
Right. Instead, we get allusions to dynamic systems theory, the dynamic element of ecological dynamics. That's referring to dynamic systems theory. The ecological part is referring to ecological psychology. And I was like, what the heck? Why are we not talking about this? I don't even think it really gets like defined or mentioned really that much at all in that first chapter. But when you start looking ahead, you're like, oh, okay, they're going to talk about it in chapter 3.
Yeah.
So that's why, to kind of give the listeners, like, why did I just read all those chapters, is so that when we were going through this and you're like, well, what the heck, why is this? Like, because I didn't walk away once we read that first section on like the ecological dynamics theoretical framework. I didn't walk away feeling like, based upon what I know the framework to be, I did not feel like the definition was given, in the way that I understand it. Like we definitely get alluded to, like what is a complex adaptive system?
Yep.
That was brought up, right?
Yep.
That was talked about. So, maybe I gave too much away there, but like.
But I think it's important because you went through those initial subheadings, but I think that flow for them in chapter 1, it does seem a little bit more rich with the dynamical systems theory, but I think they'll obviously hit that in chapter 2, but I think the thing that's important to point out is that they start with the ecological dynamics framework as their main section. And they do kind of go through the adaptation, the complex adaptive systems, the co-adaptation of like, things changing on both sides, you interacting with the environment and the environment interacting with you, and how that changes both things. And so what they then sort of launched into without explicitly saying is then they, that gave them the connection, like, hey, how does co-adaptation happen? Well, between athletes is where they end up getting, like, so how does this happen kind of in this, sometimes team sports? Well, it has to be this transference of this informational variable back and forth, and that kind of leads them into the learning design. And like, well, how are we going to then do learning design within ecological dynamics? Well, it has to have information, and that's kind of the ecological psychology portion of it. And that's where they end up sort of landing with their third, is then they talk about transfer, where it's this, you're having this performer environment relationship interaction. There has to be information there, and that has to be specifying. And so then we can start to talk about practice environments and performance environments then needing to be designed in a representative way so that that transfer happens more effectively. And so when I started to look at that, almost that grander thread, or at least how they were connecting there first, it seems like what they're trying to do is like, hey, we need to conceptualize this stuff as complex adaptive systems. And that happens through the interaction with information. And so to best make learning design and transfer from practice to performance, which is what we want as coaches, then we need to focus on that information and how constraints will shape the information that you're connected to.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Well, is there anything, how about from that first section where, that was either new or you felt like you wanted to jump in more further on when they were beginning their ecological dynamics framework as they were talking about adaptation and sports performance context?
well, I think let's maybe start with what you were kind of saying is like, let's talk about what were the chapter objectives. Do you think that's a good place to transition to here?
Yeah, well, I think they have really good, at least what they're trying to get about was like, what are the characteristics of these complex adaptive systems, and how that relates to practice design for us. And maybe that's the first question: is why are they starting with? Why are they, even if we are jumping into the deep end with this information, why are they starting with complex adaptive systems? What do you think? Why do you think that might be? Or maybe if you got into their head, how about that? If you got into their head, why do you think they wanted to start with that piece, complex adaptive systems, as sort of the entry or the foray into, let's introduce this world of ecological dynamics through complexity and adaptive systems?
I guess for me, I'm gonna answer the first question that you're initially going with, because for me, I'm gonna struggle a little bit to put myself in their head, because I was just, when I approached the text, I was approaching it so much through my own lens. And so I can answer your question. It just I want to qualify.
Yeah.
This is not me thinking about it in terms of how I don't know if this is what they were thinking. But for me, the thing that we're like, to go back of like the debate, because they're still locked in
Yes.
kind of the old debate a little bit. And so instead of them going it head on, they're simply just presenting you like, here's complex adaptive systems. Although maybe in the first like right out of the beginning, I don't necessarily see it right out of the gate. They kind of just jump straight in, assuming their position. But I think for me, okay, this concept of a complex adaptive system, I think, is huge, because we tend to actually inadvertently tend to approach the human movement system or the human being as a machine. And although a machine can be complex, it gets very, like, our approach tends to be very mechanistic.
Yeah.
And when I approached, or when I started hearing about the complexity theory or dynamic systems theory, there's a sense that complexity actually was not just like it's complicated, which is, whereas complexity is more, you have all these different interactions that are, like, you could see, this is why, going back to like laying this out in chapter, I don't know, 9 or 10, it starts talking about nonlinear pedagogy. Well, this to me, part of complexity is like the fact that the system is nonlinear, so that the inputs into the system and the multiple interacting component parts, which this chapter does very much hit on. Yeah. These interacting component parts, they are nonlinear. So, like a small input could have a big output. A big input could have a small effect on the system. So this is where, to me, this was breaking this notion that I had as a coach, for me, of thinking that A plus B equals C. Like that was, I was always like, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to give them this cue. I'm going to give them this mechanical fix. I'm going to give them whatever this is. And then when I put it in, it's going to unlock performance. Yes. Yeah. And by starting with that the system is complex, and then I'm going to throw in dynamic, not adaptive, because to me, this is where it's complex dynamic, meaning the system is changing. That was kind of the other thing, right? Because even growing up, we kept like, coaches always talked about consistency. Mm-hmm. And you're like, okay, so I need to constantly do every rep the same so I can get consistency, right? This is why I'm saying, like, this, to me, for me, why this is, I'm okay with this, and I think this is a good starting place, is because to introduce this concept, it helps break us out of this notion that we're trying to repeat perfect mechanics. And if we can
Yeah.
understand that the system is complex and it adapts, or I like the word dynamic better, it's changing. The system is not the same. Like there are invariants to the system, okay? But just like there's invariants to a river. But like the quote that we like to say in the ecological community is like, you never step into the same river twice, right? It's still the same. It's still the Mississippi River, but that water in the state is just not. It's not the same. There, it's different, and so that's where this notion and this idea of a complex adaptive system becomes really a key starting place of like a starting block to understand, or rather a view or a framework, like the lens through which we're seeing and starting to think
Yep.
about the athlete and
Well,
what we're trying to do as a coach. Go ahead.
You alluded to it, like they very briefly, they don't talk about the other theory. They just outline right away that a fundamental challenge for coaches, physical educators, strength and conditioning trainers, skill acquisition specialists, and performance analysts is to base their work on clear theoretical principles of performance and learning. And so it almost seems like they're hinting at, like, hey, you need to have this grounded in clear theoretical principles. Everybody's operating from them, whether you would articulate them or not. So instead of, maybe arguing back and forth about them, they're just going, this is the clear theoretical principle that we see. And it's that idea of complexity that I really appreciated that you opened that up, because I think the way that, as you were talking through it, I think the way that even I viewed it initially was that understanding how to have better performance for a pitcher, I'll just keep it in the realm that I coach right now, would be, well, it's more like a trigonometry equation. Yeah, it's complex, but if I can break it down enough, I can isolate certain variables and I can do the right work to figure out what input to get the output I want. And what we're saying is that's not how they're defining complexity. You're talking about complexity as it should be talked about, more from that dynamical systems where the input won't always match the output. And you could input one thing for one guy and get something different for another guy. It doesn't mean there aren't principles and things that'll work. I just had one of our young men come in and he wants to help some of our guys in their off-season work gain a little velo, because he was a little bit of our test bunny this summer to try some different things. And so he would like to do that with them. But what was interesting was when he pitched this idea to me, because we have kind of our non-contact period. And so he said, I think I kind of would like to take a group of guys through what I did. And so I asked him right away, well, what was your goal this summer? And how did you break that down? And what did you do? What was interesting to see and what gave birth was this idea of complexity, because he alluded to the ideas. He intuitively knew I had to really listen to my body. And there were times when, I couldn't push it here, or I had to do something different there. And I want to teach our guys about that. Like, what he wasn't saying is, here is my perfect, 9-day program that I rotated through all summer. And if I give it to everybody else, they'll have the same results. He's going, no. There's some principles that I think were really interesting and were good for me. But also I want to teach the guys like how I learned when I needed an extra day of rest, or how I learned like when to push it a little bit more, or when to, trail back a little bit. And I think that's the idea that I like of complexity, is that we don't have to, well, I guess we just don't know what's going to happen when we input stuff. No, that's not what we're saying. But it is saying like, you're going to have to individualize this. You're going to have to be more thoughtful than just, here's the program, right? And here's the input output system that exactly works.
Right. And one point that I want to make, and this was kind of the thing when I first approached all of like motor learning, because that was the term that was being thrown out. Motor learning back in 2017. Yep. And people are putting in their bios and all this sort of stuff. And so the assumption that I had, and then I still think a lot of people have, although it's because we use the term ecological dynamics or ECOD all the time, it's starting to shift. But we have this notion that it's one monolithic thing. And quite honestly, what people need to realize is ecological dynamics is actually a combination of multiple disciplines.
Yes. Yep.
And so so this is kind of the other element here, and it's not super prominent here, but it's the language is here.
Yep.
Like one of the things of like going back to your question of like why does this book start with, and why we're in agreement like this is actually a good starting place of talking about complexity science and or complex adaptive systems is one of the key ideas within complexity science, or more specifically, my understanding is this comes from systems theory, is that the sum is greater than the individual parts, right? So you can't. The big thing in this idea of emergence, and why with Sean and Tyler, and when we started Emergence, why we ended up with that name was that is this idea that you can't just take or break things into their component parts and think that you still have just a part of the whole, and then you can just put it back together and you have the whole thing.
Yep.
And so that's kind of the thing that's differentiating this idea of complexity versus what was the other word that I used? Complex versus complicated, right? So this is the difference here between complexity and something being complicated. Complexity here of how we're understanding and what we're meaning is that there's this notion that's embedded within it from an ecological perspective that the sum, the total of what a thing is, the whole thing cannot just be broken down into its constituent parts. You focus and work on that, and then you think, and then that'll just be able to just be integrated back in.
Well, let's get practical right now. What are some of the ways that you feel like you see within the baseball ecosphere, like people doing that very thing, breaking things down to their component parts, and then hoping that it transfers to the game, is an effective way to ultimately go to what they'll get to here, to learn, to do learning design? What do you see as some of the troubling ways that maybe aren't working quite as well as people think they are?
I think as an example, partially, I don't have any fresh ones because I try to ignore all these ways of like I just, so I don't get worked up and whatever. I don't judge the other person, none of that, right? But like, so for example, like an old one, like focusing on your scap load, right? Like as a hitter, like getting in your scap or making sure, like I'm snapping, or I'm like my hips, I'm moving, like all these like little things of like, yeah, I mean, I'm not saying they're not important, but like when you spend a whole tee session working on a feel or a specific move, and you spend a half hour to an hour on that, you know what I mean? Like that to me is this whole notion of like you're actually trying to break it down. Like for example, actually, I heard we're doing fall meetings right now. One of the guys came in, he's like talking about, I'm mentioning, that the way his swing is designed, he's missing under, and it's, he's pulling everything. And it's like, yeah, I just need to go in and just completely break my swing down and start from square one. Right. And like that to me is like the exact.
Those ideas are embedded. That's
right.
This
typifies the point we're trying to make here.
Water.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I've heard that great. It has to be mentioned. I've heard that great illustration story where it's two younger fish swimming by an older fish, and the older fish goes, "How's the water today, boys?" And the two younger fish swim by and they look at each other and they go, "What the heck is water?" Like sometimes we don't even realize what our theoretical underpinnings are, and we're coaching in that way with a theoretical underpinning that thinks, "Oh, I just have to get that movement in the brain," and that's what this is presenting, the opposite side. That's what this book is presenting. Yeah.
And to that point, yeah, and to that point, like this is such a radical shift in how you look at things, and that's why I said like sometimes, and even to be gracious and charitable to the authors, right? Like as we get further down, and this is why it's also like why I brought you on the podcast, right? Is like you're younger in your journey. You're closer to those people who are starting to look into this, right? Once you get into this, like the language, all this sort of stuff, you forget what it's like to be a novice, right? And I think that's super important to put ourselves in our athlete's shoes, right? And to be able to relate. And that's the other thing of this is like, I want to try to, I don't do great at it all the time, but the goal here is to, even with all this stuff in this language, is how do we relate this back to in language? How do we take this from this high academic thing where we're saying all the words and everybody's already shaking their head, going, "I know exactly what you mean." Like, the part of what I'm trying to do here with this, or why to slow down, is like, hey, let's stop for a second. Let's define terms. We talk as if we all understand, and like, yeah, I know this came up in college in one of my history classes. The teacher goes, when I say the word democracy, what do you think that means? And she goes around the room, and like, you get like 12 different definitions, right? And you start to realize, like, oh, we're not all meaning the same thing when we use that word. We understand what everybody is saying, but each time we say it, we mean something different. And I feel like that's true somewhat when it comes to the ecological dynamics language, is that people will throw out terms. They think they know what they mean, and they're most of the time they're close or correct or good enough for them to have success. That's the other thing I want to acknowledge for the coaches who are out there, using this stuff, like, and you're having success. This is awesome. But part of the reason to come back and try to like lay out exactly, kind of more being kind of a little bit more of a purist here, of like, I think you can potentially pull more juice out and
Sure.
reduce some of the risk of hitting a wall. Because I've also heard, I don't hear it as much now, but I used to hear like, oh yeah, we've tried ecological dynamics, we tried doing the eco-D thing, and it just didn't work for us. And that's where it's like, why I think it's important to kind of break this stuff down a little bit more, in some ways, because the real to which is ironic, right? It's like, we can't break it down to the sum of its parts and all that sort of stuff, right? But okay, but here's the contrast, and this is where these ideas go. Okay, is if you were to really truly kind of learn these ideas, it actually would be embodied, and you would be mentored, right? Like, because these ideas are through embodiment. Like, that's how they live. That's how, like, that's that, like, to get it, like, some of the, like, a key concept, and it's not in this chapter, but the difference between knowledge about versus knowledge of, right? And this is a huge argument that's going on right now within baseball, and the managers and this and that and coaching styles and all this sort of stuff is like, oh, this is why we want guys who played, all these guys who never were in pro ball and blah blah blah. Like, it's starting to flip around. But like, this is kind of what I mean, is like, I don't want you just to regurgitate these things, but in order for you to really play with them and to like really go with these ideas, we kind of want to try to start to highlight, which is what kind of, in a way, these ideas and these concepts about is like, for me and you, we're more attuned to this language. And so kind of where I'm trying to go with this is that, this is a radical way of seeing and thinking about the world. And so for people who are trying to get into this, first try to put on the whole lens and like look exactly how we see it before you start trying to apply it to your old, like, try to bring in your old stuff. Because this, for me personally, I had to first try to adopt it like whole hog and go like kind of like exactly as is. And then now I'm starting to understand how to incorporate those old ideas back in, and I'm still operating within an ecological framework, but I see people trying to pull in their old ways of doing things through the old schema model and then they end up losing the ecological approach.
For sure. I think like a good example for me that I've been fighting with a little bit is, where do you look at the mental game within the ecological sphere? Because you hear so many professional players talk about it, and while a lot of people within the ecosphere are pushing for skill acquisition specialists to be a new position, you're right, to help connect the different systems, so they're not independent, but they're working holistically within organizations. One thing that's pretty much everywhere now is mental performance coaches. And generally, when you ask anybody about mental performance, what is it? Well, you need to meditate before your game. You need to learn diaphragmatic breathing. You need to do visualization. You need to do all this stuff that's disconnected from the game. Now, I'm not saying there's no purpose for that, but how would we look at that from a more ecological sense of like, is there a space we can do that that's more representative? Or do you know what I mean? Like, I think that these are the questions we're trying to answer, is like, here's an old paradigm. How do we bring it within the ecological sphere?
Right. And so what makes, and this used to be a really common term, or like this highly talked about idea, is integration. Like, how do we integrate, like have integrated departments instead of everything being siloed, right?
Yes. Yeah.
You need, in order for things to be integrated, you do need to be on the same page, right? And so you need some sort of philosophy or a framework by which you filter and see everything to be able to integrate it. And so we had Jared Slater on here talking about Square One and how he viewed Square One as like the box, the toolbox that you put all your tools in. Okay, to me, similarly, ecological dynamics is the toolbox in which you put all the tools in, and you understand everything and how it all works together through this framework and through these conceptual ideas. And so that's why, for me, like the ideas are like, when you say ecological dynamics, you're bringing, like, it's a whole host of ideas, and they're interconnected, and they play off of each other, and they work synergistically together. And so, because like when I use that word synergy, like that's when we talk about like how the body coordinates, its degrees of freedom. There are synergies. It does that through muscle synergies, right? Or coordinative structures, right? So like these ideas are in the language, like basically plays together. It all this stuff ties together. So, anyways, I'm getting way too off on a tangent here. I do want to try to pull us back to the chapter here.
So we've done it. I hope we've done a good job of recognizing this first section that you have up there. This idea of complexity, dynamical system. Like I think that's really key, and that's what they're driving after. But then they do jump from there to dynamical systems theory, self-organization, and adaptation. What did you glean from there, or did you have highlighted there that you thought was key? Why they were going this direction?
So I just want to go off of what was highlighted versus what so one thing I want to highlight here, okay, is that the biggest knock against ecological dynamics is like, oh, well, you can't test it. Like you can't falsify it or whatever. I don't even know. But it's like, okay, so if we talk about like what is dynamical systems, it originated in a field of mathematics to model systems. So to me, I'm just like, why is there pushback from some of our analytically minded friends on this? You know what I mean? Like, this ecological dynamics can fit within an analytical approach if it's based on the field of mathematics, right? And then Rob Gray was going through Turvey's book.
Lectures on perception.
Right. And like they're talking about how Turvey is going through and laying out the framework, how to ground this thing in kind of more of the hard sciences. I don't know if it's completely hard sciences, but like he was trying to ground this in the physical sciences, right? Yep. So like this whole notion that people have is like, oh, this is kind of like a new theory, and like it's kind of not sciencey or whatever. Like it's just not based in fact. And so that's where I do want people to really recognize that there's a mathematical component to this. And if there's a mathematical component to this, then we can start to measure things. We can start to apply analytical principles to this. And again, like people don't realize there's always a lens or a framework that you're viewing things through. And so that's where I've always been trying to, through the whole purpose of this podcast, was trying to present like there's another way to begin to view things through that is going to help us ask better questions, that's going to lead to better, potentially deeper understandings of the game, and how do we develop players and get the most and maximize our player development. So I'm sorry that's didn't answer the last part of your question, but that to me is the thing that stands out the most, and that I want to kind of highlight out of this text right here is like this is a critical component that people need to recognize as part of it. And the analytical folks out there, you guys can integrate this into what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. That's good. I would highlight just that idea of these self-organization tendencies. I can remember not too long ago, maybe a year or so ago, like seeing, somebody I follow on Twitter, a track person, saying something like, it was just a misunderstanding of self-organization. Like, oh, just let them do whatever they want, right? It's like, no, like this is why it's so important to interact with these ideas, is because maybe, to your point earlier, you've just received some secondhand information, you have kind of connected with this or that, and so you don't have a firm grasp or a firm understanding of what it's actually saying and what it's saying about self-organization and these tendencies that exist. Because I think sometimes it's like, well, they're going to self-organize into the wrong things. It's like, well, wrong based on what? Your model, instead of
Or
interacting
let's be
constraint.
charitable, right? That like they're like, but they don't. They're when I let them self-organize, they don't perform well in the game. That could be also too what they're saying. And
You're,
let's just be real, right? Like that's a
for
real
sure.
legit criticism. Sorry, continue.
No,
I
I
want to
think you
acknowledge
highlighted.
that though to
Yeah.
those who are sitting there with that criticism.
I think the thing for me that's been helpful with self-organization is it goes back to this idea of looking at the whole rather than the part. That self-organization happens not because I just let them do whatever they want, but what we're talking about with self-organization is that there are these interacting constraints, and they're going to self-organize. These patterns are going to emerge, and they're going to emerge as they interact with constraints. Like, self-organization is just sort of this reality that's happening in light of what they're interacting with, as opposed to, I feel like what people hear with self-organizing is like, don't coach, don't say anything, don't do anything. And that is not a rich understanding of this, and actually doesn't unlock the power of what we see within this framework.
Well, and two, like I want to acknowledge at least where I think this comes from. And I wrote a an article on like the constraint led approach and what is it and what is it not. And I haven't put it out there yet. But I think this is the theme is similar here, and the reason kind of why I didn't put it out yet is because I kind of went hard after where I think that this notion of going from least constrained to most constrained, and like, but here's the thing, like I want to acknowledge because drive like so it originated with Driveline, but for me, Driveline was the one that were the people, the company, the organization, those the people there got me into this space, right? And they're still using it and whatnot, and they're starting to come back to it. But like they were really big on self-organizing and queuing less, because let's go with the context of where they were and everything. Everybody was queued up way too much, to the point where like everybody, like, you talk about it, like athletes are in the dome zone because they're getting so many cues and they're so internalized and focusing on their mechanics that like just simply swinging the pendulum to the other side yielded great results. Plus the
Mhm.
fact that like um, Paul Nyman had really, like, the intent was king at that point, right? Paul
Mhm.
Nyman had popularized that idea and that concept within the skill development realm, and so like that was a mode of coaching, right? Driveline for a while, like they really prided themselves on not saying that much. They've kind of swung back the other way, like, they'll post videos of how they're working with their athletes and they're queuing them up, they're coaching them up, right?
Mhm.
So like there's been a swing back the other way, but now but I think that was a misunderstanding of the text. Like, cuz again, I don't fault them at all. Like they didn't have the experience, like the we were fortunate to have extended access to Sean Miska, and then Tyler, and right. So like because of
For
those
sure.
things, right? Because of those things, we like our misunderstandings were corrected. We had somebody to
Yep.
correct our misunderstandings. So I don't
100%.
fault them at all. Like it's completely understandable to be like, oh yeah, this is kind of like, right, because a lot of all this stuff comes from the elevator pitch. Right? Like, how do we boil it down? What are the main concepts that I can pull out of this? And what do I feel like is the dominant message that's coming out of this? And so now I think the time is to come back to these things and to refine them more and get back to like they knew there was something gold here, and I don't think they were able to extract all of it out. And I still think that's going back to like where an inefficiency is, you could say, per se, is really now honing in on like how this all really works together. Because the field is maturing. I like this is the like I'm really it's fun to watch like the growth in the field of like it's getting better. It's getting better. It's it might not come as fast as you want, but like honestly,
sure.
it really is. And so so where I'm going with this is like I think we need to mature in our understanding of this. So um so like I think it's important to let's go on that a little bit because when we're starting to talk about self-organization in the previous line, it's shaped by the constraints of the system. Okay, and constraints are a key idea and concept of complex or dynamical systems theory.
Mhm.
So, and you talked about information because I want to highlight these two concepts of like when we talk about like what does ecological dynamics really emphasize? Information is huge.
Yeah.
Constraints are huge. One of the things Driveline put out a video recently, and it was a great video. Recommend everybody watch it. But one thing that I want to kind of emphasize that was maybe not as emphasized, although it is present, is the importance of information. Like I really want to highlight that for people is like information is really important. Like what is, and we'll get into it like, further down when we start talking about later in this chapter, is we get to the later half of it and we start talking about the transfer element of it, and they start talking about
and even learning design right there.
Yes, learning design
is where that starts to come. Like how does learning happen and how do you do learning design?
Right. And so what it says here is when it comes to like learning design and the acquisition of skill, it's based on the continuous information-based interactions between each athlete and the specific performance environment. And so where I kind of want to highlight there is continuous information-based interactions, right? That's where like the I guess to summarize or to kind of try to pull this all together, when we're talking about complex adaptive systems, okay, how the output that you get is based upon the interactions, and those interactions are based upon the continuous flow of information. Now, you'll also hear energy, but like energy actually contains information in it. I mean, heck, we're you're listening to this, and energy is transferring like to your phone and all this sort of stuff, and how your phone, right? So like energy basically transmits information essentially. So I say all that to say like this is what we like. To me, this becomes an important thing and an important question to start asking is like what information is relevant, right? And that's where like when we start to get into here in the last 3 sections or so. No.
You're thinking about transfer, right?
Yep, transfer. Oh, man, what? There it is. Transfer conceptualized in ecological dynamics. Right? I mean, for me personally, like if I were to summarize this like in a short, like because this is what
Yep.
for me was like game changing for me is that, and people are get this, right? Even Kyle, like I love that he had said this in his interview that he did with a big podcaster more recently, is like transfer is going to be best when it's more closely related to the context that you want it to transfer to. And it's like kind of like duh. Well, but now let's break this down. Like, okay, well, obviously, but I can't do the game all the time. So it's like, yes, you're 100% right. We cannot do the game all the time. And even though we talk about like creating slices of the game, it's like, well, how? Going back to this question that is asked continuously is how representative is representative enough? And if you go back to some of our previous episodes, we kind of start to talk about and try to tease out like, okay, if we can never get the practice environment exactly like the game or to map whatever, like how do we get it to transfer? And it's about asking that. So you have, one of the key things that is brought up in this chapter when it's referring to complex adaptive systems is like what causes the behavior of the system, and what makes the system change its state or shift its behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And so they start talking about control parameters and like higher order variables. These things, the control parameters start to become like, when we start talking about like what is specifying information, has to do with like the control parameters. I don't think they're the same. Like, and this is a higher level conversation here. Is like, I don't think these two things are exactly the same, because I also think you can start to shove a old framework, or like the traditional framework that people have for like how to develop skill, into that idea of a control parameter. Like, oh, okay, well, my leg kick controls how my body moves down the mountain, so therefore I have to really focus on getting my leg kick perfect. Like, yes, these things are somewhat related, but the specifying information that you're connecting to, or that is in the environment, is more, to me, important. Like, for me, that was kind of the highlighting thing of like, when I started interacting with stuff, is like, oh, I really need to start thinking about what is, and asking the question is, what is the specifying information that the athlete is using in the game to shape their movement? If they can connect to that information, if they can connect their movement to that information, then they're going to be successful in the game.
Mm-hmm.
And so then the question becomes, if I can identify what the specifying information is in the game, as long as I start to bring that back into the practice environment, then there's greater chance of transfer, because then the movements and the movement solutions and the way that they're problem solving has greater similarity between that and the game environment. And so that's where, to me, like this idea of specifying information, for me, was like game changing, because it changed where my focus went.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is, if we're thinking about where this chapter ends up leading, and maybe why they started with it, something that you're saying makes me think of like, well, what do we ultimately, why would somebody pick up this book? Like, why would a coach of any stripe pick up this book? Well, I want my players to be better in the performance environment, the game. I want them to be better in the game. And so what does every coach then want to do? How do I do the practice environment better? And so they finish with transfer. And how did they get there? They acknowledged the self-organization tendencies, constraints, emerging behavior, but that has to have the conversation with information, which you just highlighted. We can't talk about this without information, without the perception action coupling. We can't talk about learning design and transfer. And maybe there's more meat on the bone that we'll come back to within this chapter. Like as we wrap up, like maybe there's more meat on the bone here, right, that we can come back to. But the thing I think you highlighted that's so important there is, I think the place that they're really leading us to in this chapter, and the place that if you're entering into this world and digging into this book, is like, that is the thing that is so key. I off camera talked about this idea of the quiet eye, and some of these more in-depth things that are like, man, how to gaze behavior, and feeling like I want to dig more into those. Why? Because we're talking about what information they're connecting to, and if that's helping them get the performance outcomes they want. And I think so often we can, maybe this is the concept that was so helpful for me, and I keep going back to. And honestly, it's the place that I talk to more people. Just had somebody text me the other day, like, "Hey, what the heck is EcoD? What is that?" And the place that I usually launch into is this idea of focusing on the athlete devoid of the environment. I often use it, organismic asymmetry, right? We're not looking at the symmetrical parts and how they're interacting. We're looking at one side of the equation, and we're not even considering the environment they're embedded in. And if we're not considering the environment that they're embedded in, we're not thinking about the transfer or the exchange of information from that environment to the athlete and how that's helping shape behavior. And so I think that is, if there's one thing that you get out of this first chapter in starting to engage with the ecological dynamics framework, it is the importance, and it'll go through this in future chapters, but like the importance of information.
Absolutely.
Because that's the thing when you were saying that, Oh, duh. That's why they're going here in chapter 1. They want to talk about complex adaptive systems. Why? Well, because we're constantly adapting. Why? Because we're self-organizing. Why? Because there's information. Yeah. So what's that mean? Well, that's how we need to design learning. Why? Because we want them to transfer. And it's like, if you're going to
Right.
make your elevator pitch, it's like, we think this will help you transfer to training better
See, that's the thing
or
is where I
perform.
just don't, for me, I just don't feel like they did that very well.
That's
You know,
probably
and
fair.
so like this is the thing going back to like why are we doing this episode on this is because I wanted to kind of help people navigate it through it a little bit. I don't know that we did a great job of that. I mean, we definitely elucidated ideas and concepts, but where I'm kind of going with this too of like kind of why I wanted to kind of walk through this a little bit, is because okay, let's go through the you could say the criticism here a little bit. Like I have the chapter headings here. Okay. So we laid out what we think is important. I think not everything because there's a lot of important stuff in here, but we kind of gave a broad overview of like there's a lot of richness here. I hope
Mhm.
people can see that. But so you basically have okay. The first chapter heading is not chapter, but section heading is the ecological dynamics theoretical framework. Okay, and like I'd mentioned before, is like, okay, they really spent the majority of that section talking about dynamical systems and self-organization, if I remember what I was looking at correctly. And so,
Order and control parameter,
yeah,
co-adaptation,
yep.
metastable, degeneracy. Yep.
Well, mostly just in that one section, it's just, yeah, I mean, maybe degeneracy. No, like that's just in that section, like yeah, well, I get that is the broader over thing, but really,
When
so
they
the
keep
first
going.
thing,
Yep.
yeah, the first thing here after that is like, what is adaptation in the sport performance context? And like, I think they did an okay job with it. And here's where I'm going with all this. I'm going to just jump ahead for the sake of time. I really feel like when I first approached this, I felt overwhelmed. But when I first started, really like when Sean and Tyler were doing the movement meetups, I started talking with them. Really, they started being like, "Look, start with this paper. What is acquired? What exactly is acquired during skill acquisition?" Man,
Mhm.
that like just it laid it out more simply. It was a shorter read. Like this is where like my recommendation to people is actually don't start with the books. Start with these shorter papers because they can't go on and on. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, if you want to dive in, all this sort of stuff, like that's what a book is for, right? Is to really try to go into the weeds and flesh something out. But if you really want to get an understanding of the ideas and the concepts in like kind of like I think they do a better job in my opinion because like maybe I have rose colored glasses here because like when I sat in the first like movement meetup, man, I was just hearing all these terms and just being like, well, I mean, I'm kind of following, but I don't really know. And then I read that paper and I was like, oh, okay. Like I'm starting to see what they're talking about, like all these things that they're referencing, like it lays it out here and explains it. And I'm
Well, you
not saying
think
that explains it
constraints,
perfectly, but it
but
like,
but even within the ecological, like the sphere of like constraint shape, the
mhm.
emergence of behavior. When you're writing a paper, you have a word limit. When you have a book, there's probably not as much of a word limit. And so you do have to, when you're writing research, that's where I'm agreeing with you. I think that's a great, that was my initial foray. This seems easier, even though it's thick. This is easier to digest because I've had some opportunities to read some papers. And again, of course, the mentorship of Tyler and Sean is invaluable alongside of that. And yet it wouldn't have been possible without the engagement of some content. And this would have been like, man, where do I go from here? There's so much and there's a lot. But when you just go read about whether it's practical or just a theoretical paper, like, no, I actually trained these people and here's some principles I used, or it's more like, no, we're going to talk about this one thing within this realm. So we're going to have to like allude to these connecting pieces, but we can't expand like crazy on them. That's where the research paper does have the strength to help you learn. I don't know if faster, more efficient, what the right way to say it is, but you're not swimming in as deep waters where it feels like every time you're reading about something, it's like, man, here's a new concept where they're really expanding and bringing in other ideas.
Yeah. And that's where I even felt like here, I mean, obviously it's chapter one, but like, adaptation is a great idea and concept, and that actually is explained in what is actually acquired during skill acquisition. Because they talk about like actually we don't think you acquire a thing. You don't really acquire skill.
Yep.
Rather, how they view it is that we actually adapt. Like
Yep.
skill, they talk more about skill adaptation. And so, that, because otherwise to me, I'm looking at this and being like, okay, so what? I don't understand why skill adaptation. But this paper on what is exactly acquired during skill acquisition, like explains, like, I think really, really well and clearly why this is a really important concept. Um, and so like that's where it's like, because I mean, yeah, they explain what adaptation is, but they don't really explain like, well, what does that mean for skill? Like versus like having this notion that like, well, I learn, it's like riding a bike,
Mhm.
that notion and idea. Um, so that's where again, like some of this stuff to me just doesn't, there's not a cohesive thread that a person is able to follow and see through this whole chapter. Like they give a lot of different ideas, but they don't really, I think, string it together. So here's where I'm going with this is like, would people be interested? I don't know if like this is something I've been wanting to do is try to figure out like, and I understand, like I'm not throwing shade because I don't know that I could necessarily do it, of like, because I've always sat down and been like, I really want to create a course around like what is ecological dynamics for specifically baseball and like laying all these things out. But the challenge with all this is like every idea is connected to another idea. So like where
It
the heck
is.
do you start? Right? Like do you start with constrain to afford, because really that's what I'm looking for is like, how do I constrain this properly to afford you the ability to follow along and understand how all this stuff is connected, all these ideas are connected together in a cohesive way where you feel like you can follow along and understand it. But I think that's what's really necessary. Like, and I don't like, with emergence and having worked with emergence, we put together a course called Underpinnings. And Sean and Tyler have admitted to me like, we could do such a better job now. Like our understanding or our ability to articulate has come so far. You know what I mean? And so like that's kind of the same thing as even myself is like the more I know, the more complexity, like because that's kind of the thing, right? Like we're trying to within ourselves, like, and this is where like I think I appreciate your input here is like being a new learner, when you're first trying to learn something, you're like, I have to simplify this as much as possible. Like really at its essence, what is it saying? So that I can understand it. Because if I try to just chow like, chow down on this thing, like I'm not gonna be able to get much out of it, if I'm just trying to like swallow it whole. And so I guess that's kind of my thing here is like, especially like, because I know there are people who listen to this. I look at the downloads, and it's not like one or two people. So I am appreciative everybody who's listening and ever gets to this point in the podcast. Like I really appreciate you guys. And if you could reach out and like say like, what is it that you guys are actually wanting and needing with this stuff? Because I think that would be motivating to us to try to put together something for other people. Because I look at for ourselves, like you and me and Baker and some of the other guys like Nick Askew and whatnot, like have like how much they've really grown and flourished through like having these sort of interactions. Like, don't get me wrong, like there's nothing wrong with being self-taught, but like there's some rawness, right? Like we all know this as coaches. We all know this as coaches, right? You get the guy on campus and everybody's like freshman, whatever. Oh man, he's really raw. He just hasn't been coached. I mean, just think about that. Like if you say that about your players, like how much more is that also then not true for ourselves when we're approaching something like this? And so that would be just my encouragement. You don't necessarily have to work with us, right? You got like Sean and Tyler, they have stuff. Rob Gray has stuff. The Constraints Collective has stuff. Like there are people out there, but like I don't know how many people are specifically in baseball. That's kind of where what I want to throw out there is I don't know really of anybody who is that, who is specifically doing like skill acquisition and like, from a baseball perspective and, wants mentorship. So like that's something I want to throw out to the folks that are listening. Like if that's something that you're interested in, like, I know that's something that you've also relayed to Kyle is like, man, like community. Like I'm not like I think like I want to, personally, I really do want to hear from the community on this as like far as like what is it that people are wanting or needing, and because otherwise, like, yeah, we can keep trying to shout into the to the Ethernet here, into the ether and like, make some moves and try to influence stuff that way. But I really feel like these ideas are really best embodied in an actual, relationship way with like an actual other tangible people. So that's kind of my little rant there to try to land the plane. What do you have? Do you have anything that you'd like to land the plane on?
No, I mean, dynamics of skill acquisition to be continued.
All right. Well, if you guys want to reach out to us, you can find. Well, we now have a Twitter page. It's FTEPOD. So Finding the Edge Pod. So is our Twitter handle. You can see it. You can find all that stuff. It's in the description. You can reach out to me at GBOYUM01 on Twitter. Kyle, where can people find you if they want to reach out to you?
I don't know if there's a period in between mine, but it's just my name, Kyle Dupik on Twitter. There's not too many of us, so you'll probably find me.
Great. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed today's podcast. Until next time.
Analyzing.